All right. Good afternoon, everyone. If you are joining us for the first time, welcome to our Finding the Source program. I am Ashley Luskey, the Assistant Director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College. And I have Pete Carmichael here with me, the Director of the CWI. And we are joined today by Professor Jonathan White, who is Associate Professor of American Studies at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. Jonathan is the author of, or editor of, over 10 books, including today's topic, Emancipation, the Union Army.
Here's your coffee.
Yeah, I got mine too.
Everyone shows their coffee. So this was published in 2014. Jonathan has written extensively about Abraham Lincoln and also about legal history and in the 19th century. So today we're going to be talking kind of broadly about the election of 1864, but focusing in most specifically on the research that Jonathan has done for his 2014 book on Emancipation, the Union Army, and the Reelection of Abraham Lincoln. And Jonathan, I was wondering if you could start us off. Your book obviously challenges some long-held claims that by 1864, the majority of the Union Army, including Democrat soldiers, had converted to Republicanism. They had embraced it, whole hog, and that's the reason why 80% of the soldier vote went for Abraham Lincoln. Can you identify a source or a small group of sources that kind of led you to this project, was the inspiration for you to take on such a kind of long established historical truth about the election of 1864 and to try and complicate that story for people?
Sure. So I actually, in some ways, started this book when I was a sophomore in college at Penn State. I took a course with one of our mutual friends, Bill Blair, and it was on Pennsylvania during the Civil War. And for that class, I wrote a paper on desertion in the among Pennsylvania soldiers during the Civil War. Excuse me. And I started to look into the reasons that soldiers deserted. And I was intrigued by the fact that many of them talked about political reasons, that they were upset at Lincoln for emancipation. They were upset about things like civil liberties policies. If they were Democrats, a lot of Republican soldiers were not as upset about those things. Sorry, give me 1 second. Totally lost my breath for a second. And so I was really intrigued by this topic, especially as I looked at the executions of deserters. And so that was my sophomore year at Penn State. When I was a senior at Penn State, I took an independent study with Mark Neely. And I wanted to do an independent study with him to really be able to explore an issue related to the Civil War in great detail. And so I went to his office one day and I said, can I do an independent study with you? And he said, sure, I'd be happy to. What do you want to write about? And I said, well, I'd like to continue this study of desertion during the Civil War. And Mark said, I don't know if that's a very good topic. Come back to me in a week and we'll talk about it further. So I came back a week later and he gave me 3 topics that he knew I could do from the middle of nowhere in Pennsylvania at Penn State. And one of them was soldiers voting during the Civil War. And so I'd never heard of soldiers voting during the Civil War. I didn't know about absentee balloting during the Civil War era. And I thought that sounded like an interesting topic. And I didn't know at the time that Mark was actually planning to do his own project on soldiers voting during the Civil War, but he very graciously gave it to me. And that was actually the first semester that I was old enough to vote. That was the fall of 2000. So that was the first election I voted in. And so I spent the semester researching soldiers voting and looking into it. For Bill Blair, I had read James McPherson's For Causing Comrades, and that's how I knew about this sort of 80% number that McPherson really makes a big point out of. And so I got into reading more and more soldiers' letters. And I mean, I think with soldiers' letters, and you and Pete know this very well, of course, as well, a lot of them talk about politics. They talk about the ideological reasons that they're fighting and what they enlisted for and why they stay in the Army. And so, I mean, to get to your question, soldiers' letters were the foundation of this book. And I make it very clear in the beginning of the book that I don't try to do a representative sample in terms of how I quote soldiers. I wanted to make sure that I really got Democratic soldiers' voices out there. And what I found among the Democrats is that they, many of them are upset with how Lincoln is waging the war. They don't want to be fighting in a war for emancipation. But at the same time, they don't want to support a party, their own party, which is called the War of Failure. And so I argue in the book that a lot of these soldiers either vote for Lincoln as sort of a one-time, I'm going to vote for the Unionist Republican ticket, or they choose not to vote.
Jonathan, I'd like for you to step back a little bit because I think one of the most important parts of this book is how the military and the Republican administration deals with dissent within the Army.
Mm-hmm.
So could you give people a quick feel here for those who are Democratic soldiers and for those who decide to speak out and express their criticism about the war and about Lincoln? How did that work out for them?
Yeah, great question.
Right.
Not well. So this gets to Ashley's question as well in terms of sources. Another source that I used extensively in the book are court-martial records. And so these are held in Record Group 153 at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. And I looked extensively through court-martial records, and I found cases where soldiers speak out against Lincoln, they speak out against emancipation, they say that they're Democrats, they say that they support George McClellan for president in 1864, all sorts of things that many Republicans would have seen as disloyal. And when they did these sort of things, they could be arrested and thrown into the guardhouse and then tried before a court-martial. And if they were found guilty, oftentimes the punishments were very public. So you might be made to stand in your, among the men in your regiment wearing a placard that says, I said that this is a damned abolition war, or I said something bad about Lincoln. I mean, one of my favorites is a guy who calls Lincoln a goddamned old shit. And, he gets punished for that. And then he gets punished publicly. And everyone in his regiment knows what he has said. And what that does is it has the effect of silencing democratic ways of thinking. And so other democratic soldiers see these men being punished and they think, well, I don't want that to happen to me. And so they silence themselves, and they sometimes write about it in their diaries or their letters saying, under other circumstances, I would speak publicly about what I think, but under the present circumstances, they're not willing to do so. And I think that sort of pressure from the top down also has an effect of suppressing democratic political activity during the war.
Right. And Jonathan, then how does that challenge some of the assumptions that we make? And when I say we make, I'm thinking more about how general audiences think about the war in a very triumphant way. And we think about the War of Union, we think that is a force of unification, and that we see it as an expression of idealism. Does your conclusions about democratic soldiers, does it force us to call that into question, particularly the idealism? Or could you make the argument that these democratic soldiers, they were as idealistic as Republicans? Their idealism, though, was just different. So how would you?
Yeah, I think they were as idealistic as Republicans in some ways, but from a 21st century perspective, their idealism isn't as idealistic. So the traditional narrative has been 80% of the soldiers vote for Lincoln. That shows that they've embraced emancipation as a war aim that they support. And so from our 21st century perspective, I think that's the story we want to tell and want to believe, because it shows progress. It shows that in 1861, they were fighting for union. By 1864, they've embraced emancipation and maybe even rights for African Americans. And I think that for the Democratic soldiers, though, that's not the case. And if they vote for Lincoln, they vote for him because they see their own party as traitors, as disloyal. And they're willing to vote for Lincoln in some cases because they want to support the Union and they want to restore the Union, and they fear that their party will not support it. But they're not yet supportive of emancipation. They're certainly not supportive of rights for African Americans. And so I think that the idealism of the Democratic soldiers is different. Their ideal is to fight for the Union.
So to piggyback off of Pete's question, of course, another one of the longstanding claims about the Civil War is that it permanently revolutionizes things, right? In terms of expanding the power of the federal government permanently, in terms of, even the citation of soldiers being allowed to vote, for the first time. And I think people have this common conception that from then on out, this was this celebrated right that all soldiers have. And you found that to be not the case. Obviously we got back to that point, but it wasn't necessarily, the immediate legacy of the war. What was it? 6 states after the Civil War allowed soldiers to vote in the next election.
Yeah, it goes down very drastically because for most of these states, permitting soldiers to vote is a wartime measure. They see it as specific to this moment with the state elections in 1863. And the presidential election of 1864. When the war is over, they don't really see the need for it. So by the time you get to the end of the 19th century, there are very few states that allow soldiers to vote. And then by 1916, states are beginning to say, okay, we need this again. We're getting back into war. Right. And they begin to pass laws. But even by the time you get to World War II, it's not a universal thing that soldiers are going to be able to easily vote. And so there's still debates going on at the state level and at the federal level during World War II, 1944, for soldiers voting.
And of course, there's the pragmatic challenges, as you well note, of collecting soldiers' ballots, especially, if they're overseas, et cetera. But you also make a compelling point that voting becomes inherently tied into the idea of citizenship and how that helps African Americans win the right to vote. Can you elaborate a little bit upon that and how this election helped not necessarily draw a straight line from A to B, but helped in that regard?
Yeah, the idea that people who are willing to put their lives on the line as soldiers deserve the right to vote had really taken root in the Jacksonian era, as you have an expansion of suffrage to most or all white males. I think the one exception would be Rhode Island until a little bit later. But you have
it didn't really matter.
What's that?
That didn't really matter.
That's right. They're so small.
Come on, yeah.
But other than Rhode Island, you've got this massive expansion of suffrage in the antebellum, in the 1820s and 30s. And part of it is because of the role that men have played in the Revolution, in the War of 1812. And so they should have a say in their government. In 1836, Lincoln runs for state legislature and he issues a little handbill where he says, I go for all, having the right to vote who bear in society's burdens. And then he added in parentheses, by no means excluding females. And for Lincoln, if women paid taxes or bore arms, they should have the right to vote. So that was a very widely held view. When you get to the Civil War, by the time you get to the Civil War, most states have disenfranchised Black men. In 1860, Black men can vote in 5 states, plus New York if they had a lot of property. But most states do not allow Black men to vote. But then you have almost 200,000 Black men serving in the Union armies. And so people then begin to say, you know what, they deserve the right to vote as well. And on April 11th, 1865, Lincoln actually gives his last public speech outside of the White House. And he makes that case. He says that Black men who are either educated or who have borne arms should be allowed to vote. John Wilkes Booth is in the audience that day and says that means N-word citizenship. That'll be the last speech he ever gives. But there you have a president, first time a sitting president says that Black men should have the suffrage. And it's a really important moment that I think helps propel the argument for Black men to gain the right to vote after the war.
So let's step back a little bit. In your introduction of your book, you make reference to Mark Neely. Mm-hmm. Here I heard speak when I was a kid. He was at the Lincoln Library in Fort Wayne, and he would do roundtable circuit. So I heard him speak in Greencastle and Indianapolis, and one of his things that you pointed out in the introduction of the book, that he is a man who likes to overturn paradigms.
Yeah,
the word paradigm is a word that's only uttered in the academy, not out in public. And you, of course, as you said, you're sort of following in Neely's wake. You're a paradigm buster as well. So paradigm busters, let's think about this.
Sure.
This election of 1864, which you and others celebrate, is this great expression of democracy because soldiers were giving access to the ballot. It seems to me that is something, of course, to acknowledge and to maybe even celebrate. But the election of 1864, and getting soldiers to the ballot box was often done in ways that I think that election was deeply flawed and, in fact, very much undemocratic. But for whatever reason, in the secondary sources, as well in our conversations, we want to stress and celebrate that this was a clean, fair election. This wasn't a clean election. It wasn't even close to being one. In fact, I think it was badly flawed. Alan Dershowitz made that very same point during the impeachment of Donald Trump. Even, of course, he was making reference to the fact that what Lincoln had done in 1864. Of course, he had Stanton and others who were helping him to ensure that Republican soldiers were at the ballot box and not Democrats. Dershowitz made that observation. Hey, listen, if you want to talk about high crimes deserving of impeachment, I don't think he was suggesting that Lincoln should have been impeached, but he was like, hey, we've got an issue here, and that's a true high crime. So how would you respond to that?
Look, I think you're right. And I didn't hear Dershowitz. I didn't watch all the impeachment hearings, so I didn't hear when he made that point.
Neither did I. I don't think many people did, but that was just a little clip they took from the impeachment.
So I think one of the important things to remember, and this sort of sets the context for your broader point, is that there was no secret ballot in the Civil War era. So in the 19th century, when you voted, you went to the polling place and you would go to an operative from your political party and you would get a ballot from them. And the ballot would have all of the names. Actually, I have one here. So this is a ballot from 1863 in Pennsylvania, gubernatorial election, lists all of the candidates. And then it would often be a distinctive color, or it might have distinctive symbols on it. So this is the Union ballot, and it's got a nice American flag on the back. And so when you're walking through the polling place with your distinctively colored ballot, or your ballot with a unique symbol on it like that one, there's no secrecy. Everyone knows who you're voting for, how you're going to vote. And not only that, when you go to vote, you put your ballot into a glass bowl. Most ballot boxes back then were glass bowls. And so what that means is there's no secrecy in how you vote. Your employer can know how you vote. And if he's not happy with you, maybe you lose your job. Your neighbors know how you vote. The gang, if you're in Baltimore, the plug uglies know how you vote. And so you can be punished for voting certain ways if it goes against particular people. And so that's the first part, is that it's easy to know how people are voting, which then the second part means it's easy to act violently against your political opponents, or to intimidate them, or to commit acts of fraud. And so, yes, in the election of 1864, there was a lot of fraud. There was a lot of intimidation. In places like Missouri and Kentucky and Maryland, you had state militias and Union soldiers who were standing at the polls. They were armed. They would stop Democrats who they saw carrying those Democratic ballots, and in some cases arrest them, throw them in jail, rip up the ballots, rip up poll books. I mean, that certainly happened. In a few cases, they even threatened Democrats with confiscating their property or conscripting them into the army. Those kind of things happened in Missouri in 1864. Lincoln and Stanton were worried about election shenanigans in New York, so they actually had gunboats stationed off the coast of Manhattan in 1864, so that if there was a repeat of the draft riots, they could just start lobbing shells into the city, which is incredible to think about on election day. And then the other thing that I would point to are loyalty oaths. So a lot of states and militia or military officers created loyalty oaths for the election of 1864. And these were really controversial to a large extent because they were used to disenfranchise Democrats. So I'll give two examples of how loyalty oaths were used in very nefarious ways in this election in particular. In Kentucky, some of the military officers created an oath that required voters to swear to support the present administration and its laws, among other things. So before you go vote, you've got to swear to support the present administration. I guess you can't vote Democratic if you're going to do that. And in Tennessee, Andrew Johnson, who was the military governor of Tennessee and also the Republican candidate for vice president, required a military oath of voters that said, "I will cordially oppose all armistices or negotiations for peace with the rebels in arms." And here's the problem with that. The Democratic Party had put in its platform that they wanted an armistice. They wanted a negotiation for peace. So if you want to vote in Tennessee, you essentially have to pledge not to vote Democratic before you're allowed to vote. And the guy requiring you to do that is the vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party.
The real problem with that, though, is to cordially oppose that. I'd like to see that in action, how one cordially opposes.
I suppose if you were not cordial, maybe you could oppose him.
Yeah. Very strange language.
You know, one other thing that comes to mind to that question is in Kentucky. There was a state election in Kentucky in 1864. In the summer of 64, Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus in Kentucky. And there was a state judge who was up for re-election. And 3 days before the election, the military strickens his name from the ballot, says he's not allowed to run. And the state judge, the incumbent who's running for re-election, flees the state. And now the Democrats have no candidate for office. And somehow, miraculously, they got someone to run within that time period who ended up winning. But yeah, there were all sorts of shenanigans going on in the election. That's the Republican side. There were some Democratic shenanigans too that I could talk about.
I'll throw it over to Ashley very quickly. Is in the wake of Lincoln's reelection, was there any attempt by McClellan or any other high-powered Democrats to contest or challenge the election, or they just simply accept it as it was?
They accepted it. And the one thing that they really pushed for, which happens in January of 1865, is legislation to try to prevent future uses of the military to sway elections. Right. But McClellan, I think he goes to Europe and just sort of is gone for a while after this.
But there's no rumbling at all. No outcry, no editorials, nothing denouncing that this election, right, that it wasn't clean. Nothing like that.
There were certainly Democrats who complained it wasn't clean. And there were some contested elections, I think, in Congress after the 1864 election. But there was McClellan never challenged the results. I mean, in part, the Electoral College was it was 212 to 21. I mean, right, McClellan had no chance of winning that.
So you actually kind of preempted my question, Jonathan. I'm curious about the Democratic shenanigans that went on, you know, with the expectation that the soldier vote would be predominantly for Lincoln, or the expectation that somehow it would be fixed so that it would be for Lincoln. What were some of the attempts by Democrats either to try and stop soldiers from voting, or to stop some of the intimidation and kind of the silencing that was going on?
Yeah, so 19 northern states passed laws that enfranchised soldiers. 15 of them allowed the soldiers to vote in the field, and then they tabulated the votes and mailed home the whole tabulation. But 4 of them had what we would today consider mail-in ballots, where the soldiers put their ballots into an envelope and sign it with their name and then mail it home. And the idea there is the ballot is not actually cast until it's sent home and deposited in the ballot box. And so the 4 states that do that are Connecticut, New York, West Virginia, and Minnesota. So for New York, they've got a Democratic governor, Horatio Seymour, and he's going to be in charge of the collecting of the ballots. And he goes to the Republican Secretary of State, Chauncey Depew, and says, if you give me the names of people, I'll send them to the armies and they can collect ballots for the Republicans, and I'm going to send guys for the Democrats. And the Republicans never give him any names, and so he just orders Democratic state commissioners to collect the ballots. And so these are guys, state commissioners were people who would be near the front, and they would be there to try to do things to help soldiers. And so for these guys, they're going to collect ballots and send them home. And 5 of the New York State commissioners get arrested. And what they were charged with was forging names of soldiers on the envelopes and making out Democratic ballots and then putting them into big boxes and mailing them home. And it's estimated that they maybe sent home as many as 8,000 or 10,000 ballots for McClellan. And what they were doing was just making up names of soldiers. I mean, they weren't even using real names. They were just making things up and hoping that no one could know, like, this isn't actually a soldier, because there's no voter registration or anything at that era. And so the guys in Baltimore get arrested, and they're tried before a military tribunal. There's 2 of them in Baltimore, and the prosecutor, the judge advocate, actually calls for them to be executed. And they didn't get sentenced to be executed, but they were found guilty and sentenced, I think, to imprisonment for life.
Ooh.
Then 3 commissioners or state agents in Washington, D.C. are arrested. By now, they've kind of seen what happened to the people in Baltimore, so they lawyer up. They get lawyers to come down from New York. They make a case that they're not guilty. They also argue that they're not violating any federal law or military law, so they shouldn't be tried in a military court. And in Washington, those guys are actually found not guilty. The Lincoln administration was still absolutely convinced that they were guilty, but the military court found them innocent. And so the 2 guys in Baltimore, they wallow in prison for a few years, and eventually I think they're let out by Andrew Johnson. But they didn't sway the election. Lincoln still won New York very narrowly. But I suppose if they'd sent more ballots home, they might have been able to change the result.
So going back to your discussions about free speech in camp, and we obviously do see in letters home, soldiers are being political. They're chastising the army, the administration, different generals, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously soldiers were outspoken about politics, but there were certain parameters that they had to stay within, correct? Where they could be outspoken on democratic policies as long as they didn't directly challenge or threaten the Lincoln administration. Is that correct? Like what are the parameters, would you say, for free speech for democratic soldiers in the camp?
Yeah, under the Articles of War, you could not criticize the president, which is still true today, as I understand it. But now these are volunteer soldiers, they're citizen soldiers. These are farm boys and store clerks who are used to being able to talk their mind. And so when they get to the army, they don't fully realize the implication of, I can't criticize the commander in chief. And so they do criticize Lincoln. And those are the kind of things that they get punished for. But it becomes really tricky. It becomes very gray, because what does it mean to criticize? I mean, if you oppose emancipation, are you criticizing the president, or are you just articulating a belief that you should be allowed to speak? And so for a lot of these guys, they believe they should have a right to say, I'm not going to fight in an abolition war. But that is seen as undermining the war effort by the Republicans in the War Department. And so a number of officers, or a number of soldiers are punished for that. Officers are dismissed from the army for saying things like that. I'm not going to fight in an N-word war or an abolition war. That's violating the Articles of War.
Mm-hmm. And so that brings me to another point that you make in your book about questioning not necessarily whether there was a change of heart in the army by 1864, but also we have to keep in mind the composition of the army had changed, with perhaps some of these democratic officers or soldiers leaving, departing, being removed, so that they're no longer there. Maybe more Republican soldiers joining up as they feel they have a more vested interest in the war effort, which is also a compelling argument, I think, to make, in that the soldiers who do actually go out and vote, even though there are 20% who choose not to vote at all, and then another 20 some odd percent who do vote for McClellan,
right?
That you have to keep in mind that evolution of the composition of the army and how that is ultimately going to affect. It's not the same string of soldiers, of course, from 1861 who are still there by 64.
Right. And yeah, the one thing that I tried to do, and I have an appendix on this, is look at reenlistment rates. Yeah. And so I had our mutual friend Tim Orr help me with this. And I went to the Secretary of War reports and looked at the different drafts, and then, try to figure out who is eligible to reenlist in this period from November of 63 to November of 64. And I think that previous historians had overestimated who was eligible to reenlist, and then had gotten the figure wrong in terms of what percentage of soldiers reenlisted. And so I came up with what I thought was right. And so I just think that a smaller number of soldiers reenlisted in that period than had been previously thought. And I think that a lot of those men, soldiers choose not to reenlist for so many different reasons. So you got to be careful in generalizing. And I think that, it could be soldiers want to go home. They're tired. They've been in the army for 3 years. They want to be with their wives and children. There could be any number of reasons, economic reasons that men want to go home. But I think part of a reason that some men chose not to re-enlist was they didn't want to fight in a war for emancipation.
Sure.
And there certainly are letters and diaries that point to men who felt that way.
Sure.
And Jonathan, I think what you said, though, is that to have any understanding of soldier motivation, that one has to weave together a range of very public and political issues as well as private issues. I mean, they all, it is wonderful work that James McPherson and others have done.
Mm-hmm.
McPherson gets a tremendous amount of credit for asking the question why they fought. He certainly was not the first person. Joe Glatar's book on Sherman's march through the Carolinas, I think, is really the first person that hits that head on. So does Earl Hess's Liberty, Virtue, and Progress,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of Earl's, I think, maybe his first book, which is an outstanding one. So, but all three of them, of course, are asking that question of motivation. And I think you've nicely put it together for us, is that we cannot just look at one thing and deduce from that soldiers were motivated by this or reacted against the war because of this one issue. It's a private, public issue, and they all weave it together.
Right, and that's the point you make as well, of course, in your recent book. I think that's exactly right.
Well, I think pragmatism comes in. I think the one layer I would add is that for many of the men who voted for Lincoln, who were Democrat, that the issue of emancipation, the issue of Lincoln excessive in his use of war powers, certainly that did matter. But I think they saw in Lincoln, they saw in the administration an opportunity to bring the war to a close efficiently and quickly under him. And that is, again, something difficult for any man to, I guess, articulate. But it seems to me that they saw that the end was possibly near. And you're almost in the ninth inning. And why change the pitcher, right?
A number of them say you don't want to change horses midstream. I mean, that's a metaphor they used, and they were clearly thinking that way.
You probably didn't use the pitcher one. I doubt they did.
Well, you never know.
You're a Lincoln scholar, and as a Lincoln scholar, all of us, we all have these moments of Lincoln's presidency that speak to us, or we have a certain speech of Lincoln that's our particular favorite. I'd like for you to rank and tell us how you feel about the moment in which Lincoln, fearing that he would lose the fall election, decided to write a note to George B. McClellan, who he assumed would be headed into the White House. Could you tell us a little bit about that moment? Tell us about what Lincoln wrote, and tell us again how you feel about Lincoln's gesture at that point of the campaign.
Sure. So it's August of 1864. The Overland campaign a couple months earlier has been a disaster. Grant is stuck outside of Petersburg. Sherman is stuck outside of Atlanta. The Democrats are about to meet in Chicago to hold their convention. And Lincoln is pretty well convinced that he's going to lose. And so on August 23rd, 1864, he writes out a little memorandum that's now known as the Blind Memorandum, where he says, for some time past, it's become clear that I'm going to lose re-election, and I've got to do what I can between now and the next inauguration to try to win the war, because the next president, he says, assuming it's going to be McClellan, although he doesn't know for sure yet, but the next president's going to have secured his election on terms that are not going to be able to restore the Union. And Lincoln writes that because he can see the power of the peace wing of the Democratic Party at that point in August of 1864. And Lincoln seals this thing up, and then he takes it to a cabinet meeting, and he has his cabinet sign it. And they don't know what they're signing, but they are essentially agreeing to work with him, to work with the president-elect, to try to resolve the issue before they're out of office. And it's this remarkable moment because the Democrats in the summer of 1864 were saying, oh, Lincoln's not going to want to have the election, or, it's not going to be a free and fair election, which, of course, we've talked about. There's some questionable aspects to that. And so some people wondered if Lincoln might cancel the election. And I think that this little memorandum is evidence that Lincoln never for a moment doubted that you would have to have the election, that the election, he's fighting for democratic government, and he's going to make sure that the election is going to take place.
And respect for transition of power to a man that he certainly loathed, but a man that he had over the course of a few years had absorbed a great deal. And it says everything about Lincoln, that he was looking for the best interest of the nation and that he was willing to do this memorandum to ensure, as you said, a transition to power. I think about a lot of the gestures that Lincoln did, that maybe is one that
Yeah.
get the kind of credit or attention that it certainly, I think, deserves.
There's one other thing I'd like to point out about this particular moment that really, I think, speaks just wonderful things about Lincoln. At the same time that he's writing this blind memo, he invites Frederick Douglass to come to the White House. And Douglass comes, and Lincoln says to Douglass, you know, the slaves are not running away from the plantations as quickly as we had hoped, and I'm going to lose the election, and we need to do whatever we can to free as many slaves as possible.
Wow.
And so Lincoln and Douglass come up with a plan that they model after John Brown, where they're going to send what Douglass calls bands of scouts into the Confederacy and basically shout from the rooftops, run away now, get free now, because when Lincoln's out of office, you're no longer going to be able to get free. And Douglass was really moved by this moment because, you know, Douglass had kind of thought, well, Lincoln's only freeing the slaves out of military necessity to win the war. His heart isn't fully in it. And when Douglass saw this, Douglass became convinced that Lincoln really was acting as a great emancipator, because freeing the slaves in that way had nothing to do with winning the war. It had everything to do with expanding freedom. And so that was a great moment for Lincoln.
Is that about the same time as well?
Yeah, it's, you know, the date is slipping my mind. It might be August 29th or August 19th. It's one of those. So it's within a week of the blind memo.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
I'm writing a history of Black visitors to the Lincoln White House right now. And so I've been looking a lot at that moment.
Yeah, that's great. And what are some of your tentative conclusions? Can you give us some a little
about the Black visitors?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the big takeaway is that we misunderstand the way Lincoln treated African-American visitors to the White House because we focus too much attention on that meeting in August of 1862, where he invites the Black delegation to come meet with him and he lectures them and treats them very condescendingly. And that's the one that gets the most attention. I mean, Project 1619 spent a good deal of time looking at that and holds it up as exemplary. Right. But the reality is Lincoln met with well over 100 African Americans at the White House during the war, in social functions, at parties and levees, in private meetings, and in political conversations. Right. He always shook their hand. He always treated them cordially. There's that word again. And he treated them as equals. I mean, Frederick Douglass, after his first meeting with Lincoln, told a crowd, he said, "I suppose you would like to know how the president treated a black man at the White House." He said it was as one gentleman receives another. And that was Abraham Lincoln. He was authentic and he was genuinely kind to anyone who came and spoke to him.
Go right ahead, Ashley.
So I know, Jonathan, one of the things that you wanted to bring up in this discussion was how your research into the election of 1864 and all of these political nuances and contours can help shed some better light on our current election. Our election, you know, not just this past one, but our election policies and how we go about, electing presidents and the political, campaigning that goes on behind the scenes. We've talked about, I think, a lot of key issues that people can still find relevant today in terms of, people talking about voter intimidation and talking about, silencing, or talking about, many reasons for a person to vote for, one individual who, they find the party abhorrent, but there's one particular reason, pragmatically, politically, that they would vote that way. Are there other things that you'd like to add to that list in terms of how, I think in a very realistic way, your research on the election of 1864 can be usable to us today? And I'm always cautious when asking people to make history usable for particular purposes, because I fear that some people draw unfounded conclusions between A to B or comparing apples and oranges. But I think there are some very real, parallels and some very real context that the 1864 election can give us for understanding our current political system and the presidential election.
Yeah, I think the biggest one, other than the things you've mentioned, is that we often think of our moment in time as unprecedented. And we think that, the things we're seeing now have never happened before, or the vitriol of our politics is unlike any other time before. And we forget the vitriol of the 1790s or the 1850s and 60s or any number of other periods in American history. And so if I had to think of just one big lesson that people could take away, is that we've been here before where we've been very badly divided and had very contentious elections with all sorts of accusations flying from one side to the other. And yet the nation has survived and the system has worked. And if you lose one year, you try again in 4. And if you lose then, you try again in 4. And that was the approach of politicians in the past, certainly in 1864. And I think it's something that needs to be true today as well, that the things we're seeing today are not really unprecedented. There's been elections in contentious times and in times of upheaval in the past, and yet the system has worked and continues to work.
But Jonathan, I'm going to push back on that.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, we can say, yeah, the system works. And yeah, to a degree that is true. In a sense, we have recovered or rebounded from that. But often what we overlook is that there is damage that is done. That damage maybe is not irreparable, but certainly the recovery time just doesn't happen overnight. And the damage that is done can, in fact, have a residue that lasts for a very long time. So if you plant the seeds of distrust in the minds of people, for example, for today, when you call an election that is illegitimate, in which there's not a shred of evidence to prove that case, and you now have convinced God knows how many people that the election that has just occurred is fraudulent, please, I don't think we can sit back right now and say, well, the system will recover eventually. We don't know that. Maybe it will, but then again,
right. No, you're right. I mean, we obviously can't predict the future and don't know. And
I don't draw much confidence or comfort from the past in saying the system will prevail. It always has, and it always will. Right? I mean, I don't know how we can be, like you said. I feel comfortable when I look to the past, but look into the past to look to the future. I don't know about that. Right?
Sure. I mean, look, I think of Ben Franklin's very famous line when he walks out of the Constitutional Convention and a woman comes up to him and says, "What kind of government have you given us, Dr. Franklin?" And he says, "A republic if you can keep it." Yeah. And the point there is kind of the point you're making, that there's no guarantee that the system will work. It requires people who are going to be engaged and active citizens, who are going to pay attention, who are going to become informed. And we can't be guaranteed to have that at any time. So yes, there's no guarantees that that the future will, what will be in the future. But I
said how we are now informed about politics in general is just so radically different from what happened, even 10 years ago. And I mean, again, we can look back to the 19th century when journalists came clean, right? When they said, hey, I support the Democratic Party, right, or I support the Republican Party. You knew what you were getting.
Yeah.
Now today, of course, the journalists pretend that they don't have a certain partisan angle, but they clearly do.
Right.
And it just is, again, what is somewhat distressing to me is to see that Americans now, they go to where they get their biases confirmed on the right and the left. And I don't see how that.
But that is very.
It's going to break it. Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, if you were a Republican in 1860, you got the New York Tribune. If you were a Democrat in 1863, you got the New York World. So I think people have always wanted that confirmation bias. But you're right about the difference. Now journalists pretend like they're non-biased. Then at least they acknowledge it.
Honest.
Yeah.
All right. Jonathan, it's always great talking to you, man. I know you got class to go to.
Yeah, I got to get to class in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, no, it was good.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks for this. Happened to work out at the right time when people are thinking about these issues and elections and politics and maybe needing some bigger perspective. So thank you for your insights and for sharing your perspective and your context.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Great.
Thanks.
Ashley, who do we have for next week?
Next week we have, I believe it's Kate Mazer, who will be talking again more about Lincoln, one of her books on Lincoln. Yeah. So next week, 12:30. Thursday, we will be with Kate Mazer and then taking a break for Thanksgiving before our final 2 programs.
Great. All right. Take care, Jonathan. It's good seeing you. All right.
Thanks, Jonathan.